Greetings and welcome to my channel, Take Control of Your Health. I'm Dr. Corey Stern. And if this is your first time tuning in, I want to extend a warm welcome to you. And please make sure to take a look at all of the videos that we've uploaded on this channel, because all of them are going to contribute to your knowledge about how to optimize your health and how to minimize your risks from the toxins that the bad guys are poisoning you with and trying to make you sicker, weaker, and stupider. And if you're a returning viewer, welcome back. Thank you so much for all your support. If you haven't yet subscribed, please hit the subscribe button now and make sure to like the video if you like the information that you're getting, because it helps other people to find the videos. So today I am really excited to have a guest that I've known for a long time, but he didn't know me, whose work I followed, who I have a great deal of respect and admiration for. And his name is Dr. Larry Palevsky, and he is a New York State licensed pediatrician who utilizes a holistic approach to children's wellness and illness. So that's also what I do. I don't specialize in children, but we see children and adults. So he and I are doing very similar things. And what he doesn't know is that his office is not really that far from mine. It's about 40 miles away. So, and in New York, that means it's about an hour driving with traffic. So we do have a lot of patients in common. So today we're going to be talking about a topic that's somewhat controversial and, in my opinion, should not be controversial. I just want to get to the facts about it and understand the data behind it, so it doesn't have to be controversial or emotional. So I would like to turn over the mic to Dr. Larry, and if you, Doc, if you want to add anything about yourself or your background, feel free to do so, and then we'll start on today's topic.
Okay, Dr. Corey, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. Just for your listeners, I'm an NYU School of Medicine graduate from 1987 and did a 3-year pediatric residency at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York from 1987 to 1990. And then a year of fellowship at NYU Bellevue in the outpatient department from 1990 to 91. And for the most part, the first, from 1985 as a third-year medical student to the year 2000, I was pretty ensconced in Western medicine. I worked in a pediatric emergency room in the Bronx. I covered a private practice on weekends on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. I ran a pediatric intensive care unit at a hospital in New York. I worked in a neonatal intensive care unit. I did rounds with medical students and residents in the inpatient ward at the same hospital. I went to the delivery room. I took care of well newborns. I took care of sick newborns. And I also had an outpatient clinic. And for the last 20 years, I have been in my own practice looking at broader ways to help children move through acute and chronic illnesses without suppressing their symptoms, and also working to prevent illness by educating parents on all the factors that could create a disharmony in their bodies. And so I look at the body systems, I look at the mind systems, I look at the heart systems, and I look at the spirit systems. So all of those things are incorporated into my office. And I have a lot of fun doing it. I see a lot of really, really healthy kids. And for the most part, the most controversial subject that we seem to talk about, at least I started to get involved with over 22 years ago, was this subject of inoculations. And when I started medical school in 1983, I had no idea that this was a controversial subject. And it wasn't until 1998 that a mother came to me and said, "Dr. Larry, did you know there's mercury in these inoculations?" And I said, "No. What else is in there?" So I didn't brush it aside and say, "Oh, don't worry about it. There's nothing to worry about." I actually delved into it even further. And around the same time, I saw a toddler in my outpatient clinic who got a series of vaccines and within 24 hours had this massive swelling of lymph nodes throughout his body, in his neck, in his underarms, and in his groin. And I'd never seen that before and was perplexed. And so when I started researching more into the inoculations, I realized that there was a lot of information there that I was never taught. And then when I started to ask questions about, well, what's the safety of these ingredients and have they ever been tested? And what happens to these ingredients once they're injected into the body? And are they cleared? If they aren't cleared, where do they go? And I found no scientific literature to actually support an answer one way or another as to the outcomes of these ingredients. So none of the ingredients in the inoculations has ever been studied individually, injected into humans. So even though people say, well, mercury's no longer been removed, no longer in the inoculations, that information is based on what they have been told. But actually, if people did their own research, they would find that mercury is still in the inoculations, and it's in the inoculations at a very, very, very trace amount, except in the flu inoculation, in which case it's in higher amounts. But it's in trace amounts in the inoculations where it used to be in very large amounts. But because it's so small, the manufacturers don't have to include it in the package insert. So mercury in and of itself is neurotoxic. And if you want to know what happens to it when it's injected into the body, you're not going to find any of those studies. But what's more interesting to me is that because mercury isn't the only ingredient in the inoculations, it has the potential to interact with some of the other ingredients. And if it interacts with any other ingredients, we certainly don't have that science either. And so aluminum is a very strong and powerful metal in the inoculations that is meant to catalyze the immune system's response to the bacteria and the viruses and the bacterial and viral particles that we inject into the body to create our immune system reaction to, develop antibodies. And the aluminum has never been studied to identify where does it go once it's injected into the body. But if you look in the animal studies, you will find that aluminum in the form that it's in the inoculations, because it's not the same form that it's in when you inhale it or when you eat it or when it's on the ground. It's in the form of something called a nanoparticle. And in the form of a nanoparticle, it has the potential to enter into every cell of the body. And every cell includes the brain. And aluminum is a known neurotoxin. It just is. I mean, I'm not making that up. Anybody can find that that's true. But the question I've always asked is, with 1 in 35 children with autism, and 1 in 5 children with neurodevelopmental disabilities, and 1 in 10 children with ADD and ADHD, and 1 in 20 children under the age of 5 with seizures. One has to ask yourself, well, what's going on with the brains of our children? And so whenever I've asked the question, well, does aluminum enter the brain when we inject it in the body through these inoculations? And you will not find any supported literature that traces the aluminum from the inoculation to see whether it enters the brain. And the most worrisome part about this is that the inoculations with the aluminum contain the viruses and the bacteria tightly bound to the aluminum. And so if aluminum is going to get inside the cells, which there is evidence that it does, and if it's going to go inside the brain, which there's evidence that it does, then it's bringing with it viruses and bacteria or any other particles that might bind to it in the electrical charge in the inoculations. And so we're not just worried about aluminum entering the brain or entering the cells. We're worried about anything attached to aluminum that brings it in to the brain or inside the cells. And what's interesting is that again, aluminum's not alone. So if there's mercury in the presence of aluminum, that combination, even in the smallest amounts, can magnify the toxic effects of mercury and aluminum on the tissue than if you just had mercury alone or aluminum alone. So we can't look at any of these ingredients in isolation. We have to understand them in terms of their relationship to other ingredients in the inoculations. And so what's interesting is that when we're looking at the COVID-19 inoculation, we're noticing that they're using something called lipid nanoparticles, which are nanoparticles that are bound with fat, which definitely increase the body's absorption of these particles inside the cells and inside the brain. And I think what's missing is that people aren't aware that the regular vaccines, the regular inoculations, have lipid nanoparticles as well. And that's the tragedy here, is that the aluminum is also in the presence of an emulsifier called polysorbate 80. And polysorbate 80 is a lipid lover. So it goes inside fat, and the brain is about 2/3 fat, and the cell membrane is fat. So anything that's going to bind to the aluminum is then covered by the emulsifier as a lipid nanoparticle. And that lipid nanoparticle is greatly, greatly capable of entering the brain. And we see that in animal studies where drug companies have taken just nanoparticles attached to drugs and given it to animals. And they found that the drug was able to pass into the brain because of the effect of the nanoparticle bound to the drug. But then when they took the emulsifier, the lipid emulsifier, like polysorbate 80, and they tied it to the aluminum nanoparticle, creating a lipid nanoparticle, they were able to increase delivery of the drug 20-fold than you would see if you didn't have any of the emulsifier at all. And so that's essentially what we're doing with these inoculations. We're creating the entry of these materials into the brain and inside the cell of any cell in the body, wherever it may travel. No study in humans has ever demonstrated what we know to happen in animals. But yet, we see all this immune destruction and all this brain impairment in children and adults who are given the same types of ingredients. And so it's not that far of a bridge, Dr. Corey, to see that if it's happening in animals, when you use those same models of technology, then it's going to happen in adults and children, even if you haven't studied it, right? And this is where the problem is that it's almost unfathomable for the human nervous system and the human heart and the human brain to believe that the same structure of technology that enhances the delivery of drugs into the brain is being used in the technology of inoculation. And so, someone would look at that and go, well, why would they do that? And that's where you start to go down that unfathomable, unbelievable, and inconceivable path, because this is not something that's a mystery. It's easily known. And the people who are manufacturing them know this. Now, what their intention is, I can't say because I've not spoken to them. But the intention appears to be rather pretty obvious, because in the over 20 years of taking care of children in my practice who have not received inoculations, I'm not seeing 1 in 5 children with neurodevelopmental disabilities in the uninoculated population. I'm not seeing 1 in 35 with autism. I'm not seeing 1 in 20 under the age of 5 with seizures. And I'm not seeing 1 in 10 with ADD and ADHD. And so that's 20 years of observation. And some of my colleagues in pediatrics have made the same observations and have actually published those studies, and much to the chagrin of the powers that be, who have done everything they could to remove his license and stop him from practicing medicine, all because he was doing science, which is comparing the health outcomes of children who were inoculated versus those who were not inoculated, and finding rather easy data and obvious data that children who are not inoculated had fewer chronic illnesses and fewer office visits and fewer immune dysfunction and fewer neurological problems. And so I go back to this idea that is that something that the human brain and the human heart can conceive of? And for the most part, no. Because most people are not able to incorporate the idea that they would do something to harm you and that you actually played a role in it because you didn't do the homework yourself. You just trusted the almighty, sword that said, you're going to get this because we told you it's safe and we would never do anything to harm you.
It's no different than eating food that has poison in it and just thinking the food manufacturers have your back. Or,
right.
Here's another thing that I always bring up. Have you ever thought about why the Food and Drug Administration are in the same governmental department, right? So you're being poisoned with foods, being made sick, and then put on prescription medications to deal with the symptoms of the sickness that the toxic food caused. And so it's no different with this topic, right? It's just people trust their medical doctors. They trust, sadly, TV commercials. They trust mainstream media, perhaps not so much the viewers of this channel, but just the general population. And that's where, I always ask this question, where do you get your information about health? Where do you get it? And that's the answer. You get it from mainstream media, TV shows like The Doctors or Dr. Oz, from reading magazines and from, going on Google and from your teachers in school and your parents. And the truth is that we've been being misled with misinformation for at least for the entire 20th century, maybe before that. I actually found some research going as far back into the 1700s with one of the Rothschilds who created a 25-point plan to take over control of the planet, and two of the items on that plan were to mislead people through propaganda about health and to addict them to substances like alcohol. And back then they had less substances available, but still that was always part of the agenda. Right, so right. The question really is, why? This is my question about this topic that we're talking about. Why do people become so absolutely insane about this topic on both sides? Well, on the side of children who've been injured, I understand a parent's need to protect other children and to get the word out and to be vindicated, because as we know, the manufacturers of these inoculations are not liable for any damage caused. So parents who have damaged children really can't get much justice and then have to deal with a damaged child for the rest of their life. But the people on the other side of it, people who think that this is a good idea to inject these toxins into the body and who maybe don't see the injury caused because they were fortunate, for whatever reason they were fortunate, or they're not making a connection between whatever health problem themselves or their child has and the inoculation. And they get so very, very angry at people who are clearly seeing that these inoculations have caused injury. So there's so much hostility. And that's why we're not using the V word on this channel, because we don't want it. We don't want the video to get pulled off. So where does that come from? And that's what I have to work on with my patients all the time,
Right.
really, to unprogram them, to re-educate them. And by the way, I've been in practice 20 years also, and I have seen a lot of injured children. And sometimes we've been very successful at repairing them.
Right.
But also injured adults, not just
Sure.
children.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, obviously, this is a loaded answer, and I'll do my best to approach it. The majority of parents who speak out about the dangers of these inoculations are ex-inoculators. In other words, they went in with full devotion to the medical establishment. They went in believing that they were doing the right thing for their child or for themselves. They went in believing that the system that they were going into could be trusted, had done its homework, and was in the most altruistic way working to protect their children from harm. And when they had the experience opposite to what they thought they were walking into, they found out that the system itself wouldn't believe their experience at all. And when they watched their child or children or themselves and other relatives become maimed, severely injured, die, chronically ill, there was no one around to actually acknowledge that they had had the experience that they had had. And I sort of liken it to the idea that 100 people punch a wall, break their fifth metacarpal bone in their hand, and they walk into the emergency room and they say to the doctors there, I broke my hand. And they get an x-ray, and the x-ray shows that they broke their hand. And the doctor says, how did you do this? And all 100 patients say, I punched the wall. And all of the doctors say, no, that's not how you broke your hand. As if there's this superior expertise over your experience that somehow can know better about your experience than you do. Because again, it's an unfathomable possibility. It's inconceivable. And for the parents who experience this tragic event or tragic events, it was inconceivable to them as well. And it was unfathomable that something would go wrong. Why would anything go wrong? The system is doing all that it can to protect my children, and we believe in this system. And more their experiences were denied by the system that they were trusting, and they had no recourse at all. The system turned them away and completely denied their experiences, and then went on continuing to propagate the same horror to more and more children every day. And so not only was the system not believing them, but family members couldn't believe them, and neighbors couldn't believe them, and friends couldn't believe them, because the devotion to the system has become so great that it has annihilated our own inner being as a separate entity from the system. And so there are three ways to know things. At least this is how I believe we have three ways of knowing things. One is through intuition. Two is through our own research, our own experience, our own trial and error, our own experimentation, real-time experience that gave us the observational knowledge and the experiential knowledge that said, I know this because I went through it, because I researched it, because I tried it, because I tried it again, because it happened to me enough times for me to see that it's true. And then the third way of knowing is being served information from an outside source. And what I have experienced over my lifetime, in especially since my childhood that I can remember, is that more and more people were succumbing to the third way of knowing things and just lopping off number one and number two, just letting it go. And the knowledge from the system was so much greater and so much more powerful and so much more exalted that one and two just went away. And so if you ask many of the mothers and fathers whose children were damaged or who were damaged, they would say to you, I knew in my heart not to do it. And I went in and did it anyway. So they had the intuition and they ignored it, because the power of number three, the power of the outside information, was so great that it overcame any of their own intuition or even any of their own experience from family members or friends who they watched go through the same thing and say, no, that's not possible. And so we have watched an erasing of our intuitive knowledge and our experiential knowledge for the greater good of the external knowledge. And that's the government, that's the medical system, that's the media, that's science, that's Hollywood, that's everything outside of us. And so when you try to speak to people whose knowledge base comes from what they've been told, and they've held on to that as such devoted truth, and you try to expose it, you are met with tremendous resistance, because ultimately that's the house of cards, because it's really the facade of a building, like a set in Hollywood where there's just a junkyard or some kind of, empty set behind it, because there's really nothing there. Because the people who are espousing such conviction have done no homework. They've done no research. They've done no experiential learning. And they've ignored any intuitive sense of themselves to actually be open to the possibility that they're wrong, or that they have incomplete information, or that they didn't do their homework. And that is a psychological trauma, because if someone with that devoteeism, that conviction based on a trust of an external authority, having lopped off its own intuitive powers and its own research and experiential powers, if you open to the possibility that you have trusted and shouldn't have, there's a lot of damage that comes up, because you have to then recognize that you were duped, that you trusted, that you gave over your power, that you allowed people to harm you, you allowed yourself and your loved ones to be harmed, that you were wrong. And then all this rage and anger starts to surface because you lost control, and you were you were essentially broken. And that's the path that most parents have gone down when they became ex-inoculators, because they actually had to realize, oh my God, I ignored my intuition. I ignored my own research. I ignored my open-mindedness and curiosity to other information that is available if we're willing to incorporate it into our beings. Oh my God, I lost my intuition. Oh my God, I gave up my power. Oh my God, I let somebody harm me. I was traumatized. I hurt myself. I hurt my loved ones. That's the process that many ex-inoculators have gone through. And that's the process that more inoculators may need to go through in order for the threshold to be reached where people say, okay, I'm taking back my intuition. I'm taking back my own research, my own experience. I'm looking into this myself. I'm not giving you your pedestal anymore. I'm not buying what you're saying. And I'm going to delve into this subject and I'm going to pick it apart because I'm smart and I can do this research and I know how to read this. And maybe herd immunity isn't what you say it is. And maybe safety isn't what you say it is. And maybe the uninoculated are not a danger. And maybe these inoculations don't really stop the transmission of germs. And maybe there is increased chronic illness when these materials are injected. And maybe we haven't really done due diligence. Maybe you have immunity to liability because you know that you're doing something really wrong and you got away with it scot-free. Because before 1986, Dr. Corey, the manufacturers of these inoculations were getting sued left and right. I mean, they were getting called on the carpet. They were getting smashed financially. And they went to Congress and said, we can't keep doing this if you are not going to protect us. So Congress decided to protect them. And so to tell people that there's no oversight in safety in manufacturing, or there's no oversight in testing, like, the it's like the car manufacturers are doing the safety testing on their own cars. The inoculating manufacturers are doing the safety testing on their own inoculations. It's the fox guarding the hen house, and everyone's fine with that. They think that's okay. And why wouldn't I trust them? Why would they do anything to harm us? Well, in fact, in 1986, when the manufacturers got almost complete immunity to liability, there was one piece of that legislation that gave the responsibility to the Health and Human Services, HHS, to every 2 years give the American people updates in safety testing of these inoculations. Now here we are in 2021, 1986. That was 35 years ago. And HHS hasn't written one report updating the American public of its evaluations of ongoing safety measures and safety data. I mean, we should have had 17 reports already, right? We should have had 17, and the 18th report every 2 years should have been out next year. And so, again, these are items of wooden nickels going into slot machines, because it's unfathomable for the nervous system that has been living in a house of cards to say, no. Because if you show me how little I really know about this subject, I'm going to be really embarrassed and I'm going to be humiliated. And so I have to do everything I can to keep this house of cards from falling down. And so I'm going to fight you. and I'm going to resist any information that you could possibly give me. Right. And what's interesting is that, ICANN, which is the Informed Consent Action Network, ICANNDecide.org, which is a branch of what Del Bigtree does with the Highwire. They subpoenaed the CDC in 2019, 2020, and said, you claim on your website that inoculations don't cause autism. And we are subpoenaing you to show us all the studies that you've used to support your claim that these inoculations don't cause autism. And the CDC came back after much prodding and pushing with nothing. They had not one study in their bag of tricks to support the claim that these inoculations don't cause autism. And yet, all the people with the house of cards walk around strongly bellowing with pride. Well, that's been debunked. Vaccines don't cause autism. And so then if you try to ask them, okay, so where did you get your information from? Or tell me how you know that? Or what research have you done? Or have you looked into the inoculation ingredients? Or anything along that sort? They stop and they get mad at you and they resist you and they either walk away or they start fighting you left and right. And they call you names and they call you a quack and they say you're an idiot and you're one of those and you're a danger to society, you're endangering children, you're a baby killer, all those things which deflect from the process of thinking and being curious and being willing to be wrong and using your intuition and researching and weighing both sides. And so we are at a critical point in our culture, in the world, and in our consciousness, where we are starting to gain back our intuition and our own critical thinking. And that we are starting to see the external authority as a source of knowledge, but much lower on the totem pole and much lower weight given and much lower credibility given to that authority because it has lied, it has cheated, and it has maimed. And the only way for people to know that is to go through the process, because nothing I'm going to say is going to make a difference unless those people are curious, are willing to be open, are willing to learn something new, are willing to be wrong, and are willing to transform. Because as long as the authority only becomes your source of information, we are screwed. And that's what the parents and any of the adults who've been maimed have gone through. They know that they got screwed because they stopped their intuition and they stopped their own research and they let the external authority bully them and take over. And it's time to take back our health, as you so nicely state in your introduction about what you're doing in these podcasts.
And I think also your point about being disconnected from our intuition, when you're constantly poisoning yourself with toxins in your food and your drink, it's actually more difficult to access your intuition. You're literally poisoned, you have brain fog, you don't function as well. So that's part of my purpose is to help clean up people's bodies so they can actually think critically, so that they can make decisions, so that they can look. I won't even say look at research, because right now, from in my viewpoint, there's no such thing as science anymore. Science is supposed to be something objective and unbiased, and you're not really seeing that out there anymore.
Right.
You don't know what you can trust, and people don't learn how to evaluate research. I learned in chiropractic school, we were taught how to evaluate research and look at who's funding the studies and things like that. But most people don't know how to look at research, and there's just not a lot of good research going on right now. It's all very biased. But I think that ultimately your point is spot on. Without your intuition, you can't make good decisions.
Right.
That has to be a part of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I mean, where's your power from? Where's your
Right.
authority?
Mm-hmm.
And again, we're having to move back to our center and realize that we have, as a consciousness, as a society, as a world, we've given up our trust to an authority that may not have had our best interests at heart. And this has been going on for decades. And, one would call it a conspiracy theory, or another one would call it strategy, or another one would call it truth. Right. And again, it's just a matter of whether your nervous system is capable of engaging in that level of truth, because it's not my truth. It's a truth. I mean, it's there. It's not right in front of you. It's like, there's a dead horse smelling up your front lawn for the last 50, 60 years. And you keep saying, I don't smell anything. There's nothing on my lawn. And yet everyone's looking around you going, how do you not see that? Well, because they said there's no horse on the front lawn smelling up the place. So it must be something else. That's really where we are. That's the hand breaking against the wall. And it's sad that the majority of people who are able to get this are getting it at the expense of their health, their children's health, and sometimes their children's and their lives. Because, I mean, ever since the 90s, I've been looking at the literature on these inoculations, and I'll never forget there was an article that came out in 1998 looking at the hepatitis B inoculation in children and the adverse events. And it was looking at, like, I think 1993 to 1998. And it was looking at babies who had died of sudden infant death syndrome, claimed to have occurred after the hepatitis B inoculation. And the study concluded that there was no correlation between the hepatitis B inoculation and the increased incidence of sudden infant death syndrome in babies. And the article listed the autopsy findings of almost all the babies. I think there were 17 babies. And there's a very specific definition of what pathology looks like that allows you to call it sudden infant death syndrome. And not one of the babies had a consistent autopsy finding with sudden infant death syndrome. Some had myocardial infarctions, which is heart attack. Some had, bleeding here and problem. I mean, there were no specific findings that are consistent with what we know of to be the pathology of sudden infant death syndrome. And yet anybody who read that study would say, how is this not seen? How is it that we're accepting these autopsy reports, which are not consistent with sudden infant death syndrome? How are we accepting that as sudden infant death syndrome, when it's clear that there was other pathology in these babies, and it was just ignored. And the study was applauded as a demonstration of how safe the hepatitis B inoculation is. And so this has been going on for even before I became aware of it. And again, when you share that study with someone who's sure, what are they going to do with it? Oh, that's not possible. Like, it's truly, Dr. Corey, a wooden nickel in a slot machine. And it's sad. It's really, really sad that we have gotten to the place where we are so certain, because of what our authorities tell you and tell us, that it's unfathomable to believe in uncertainty and unknown and curiosity and being wrong. Because then you know what happens to the public when the public becomes aware of how duped it was. You have war, right? You have unrest. And it's interesting that you said about, brain fog. There are food proteins in many of the vaccines. And, we have had, over the last 30 years, a surge of people having fatal allergies and significant allergies that weren't fatal. And everyone's like kind of looking around going, why is this happening? Why is this happening? I said, well, if you're injecting food proteins into the body and you're putting it with an adjuvant like aluminum, it's going to spark your immune system to mount an immune response to reject the food protein. And so there's dairy protein in the inoculations, there's gluten protein in the inoculations, there's egg protein in the inoculations, there's soy protein in the inoculations, there's nut and tree nut proteins and similar proteins in the inoculations. And those are the biggies that are huge allergens.
And by the way, food's not supposed to go directly into your bloodstream. It's supposed to go through your digestive tract. That's
correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
So.
But the thing is that with an adjuvant, you actually spark the immune system to reject the food.
Yeah.
And I once said this to a Yale PhD,
mm-hmm.
the head of a huge vaccine system at Yale, who also sits on the WHO. And he said to me, are you really saying that such a small amount of food in the vaccine is going to make any difference? Come on, give me a break. That's his scientific assessment, right? And I just looked at him in half disbelief and half belief, because I knew that he really thought he was right.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens then is that you eat these foods after you've been sensitized, and it creates an immune response in your body that does give you a brain fog. And the reason it gives you a brain fog is because it signals your fight or flight response in the back of your brain that you're in trouble. And when your fight or flight response in the back of your brain is triggered, your front thinking brain, to pay attention, to focus, to think, to reason, to analyze, to be aware, to be conscious, to comprehend, shuts down. It shuts down. And so you create this fight or flight response in the body. And all of a sudden you have a lopped off frontal brain. You're not thinking. You're not paying attention. And so you walk around in a fog. And that's what we're creating. And people are so addicted to these foods that they can't possibly stop them to actually come out of the fog. Because what do they say, Dr. Corey? They say that the foods you eat have nothing to do with your health. I remember in 1983, the dean of the medical school, who's no longer alive, one of the first things he said in the first opening comments welcoming the class of 1987. He said, nutrition is not a field of medicine. That was 1983. And I don't know why it stuck to me, but I remembered it because I had no knowledge of nutrition at the time, but it stuck. Something in me said, that's odd that he would say that. And that's the going theme. That's what the government, that's what industry, that's what media, that's what medicine, that's what institutions will tell you. Eat whatever you want. Eat whatever you want.
I have to say that my medical doctor patients, it's a lot more difficult for me to change their diet. They have to unlearn that concept.
Right. House of cards.
Yeah.
Right. Because if, I've literally heard people say, well, if my doctor, if that were true, my doctor would know it and my doctor would tell me.
Right.
Like, wow, you have no say here. Is that what you're saying? Mm-hmm. You have no say. So there we are.
Yeah. That's wonderful. My heartfelt hope is that this video will help save a lot of people from becoming human guinea pigs themselves or their children, and help them to make the right decision for themselves with the information that you provided. So yeah, if you have nothing else, we'll end it, just because I know people don't like really long videos. The average view time is a lot shorter than how long we spoke, but I'm hoping that even if you don't have time to watch it all at once, I hope that you will watch this whole thing, because this is loaded with really important information. So again, I want to thank you so much, Dr. Larry, for your time. I know you're very, very busy. We're going to post links to all of Dr. Larry's social media and his website so that you can follow him if you want to. He has a lot of other videos besides this one that you can watch. And I think I probably watched them all myself already. And once again, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done that yet. Hit the like button. And most importantly, though, please share this with anyone you think needs to hear this information. We're trying to reach as many people as we can to save lives and to help you to be as healthy as you can possibly be, to live as long as you possibly can, and be as productive and happy and healthy for the rest of your life. So thank you again. I wish you all well, and we will see you again very soon.